Hi, it's Sean Nynan from Leeds Frailty Education. How do healthcare professionals assess and communicate a patient's level of cognition? I've often heard people say things like, this patient is confused, or this patient is not that confused, or this patient is orientated, and this patient is compos mentis. These aren't very helpful ways to describe someone's cognition. What if there was a better way? Well, there is. We already have to use the 4AT to screen for delirium, and it's very good at that, but it's also fairly useful at describing someone's level of cognition. People who work in healthcare will be used to using the NEWS score to roughly describe someone's level of acute illness. So if you do work in healthcare, you'll have an idea of what somebody with a NEWS of 0 might look like, or a NEWS of 5 might look like, or a NEWS of 12 might look like, appreciating that there are obviously differences between patients. In the same way, a 4AT score can be a valuable piece of information about a patient's cognition. Let's go through this. A 4AT score of 0 is the only normal score in a 4AT. Now remember, the questions on the 4AT are pretty simple, but if you score 0 on the 4AT, it means you're not acutely confused, you're able to follow what's going on, and you're able to say the months of the year backwards. You've answered all the questions of the AMT4 correctly, and you're alert. You're not obviously drowsy, and you're not obviously hyperactive. So that's a 4AT of 0, and gives a rough idea that somebody's got a reasonably good level of cognition, bearing in mind that they are pretty simple tests, so you might still have an underlying memory problem, but at least you're alert and orientated and able to answer questions that are simple, at least fairly accurately. A 4AT of 1 means that you've made one mistake, and you've made it in one of two areas. You've got one thing wrong from the AMT4, or you've got everything right from the AMT4, and you scored 1 for months of the year backwards. And you'd score 1 if you refused to start or couldn't get 7 months correctly, but you've engaged with the question. You're not obviously inattentive. So again, a 4AT of 1 gives me a rough idea of someone's cognition. This patient has some degree of cognitive problems, but it's mild compared to some other people's. Again, there's a variability, and it might hide a wide variation of levels of cognition. 4AT of 2 is scored in one of two ways. So you might have scored 1 for AMT4, you've made one mistake there, and you've scored 1 for the months of the year backwards in the same way that we showed before. You've refused to start, or you've made some mistakes. You can see that there is a way to score 2 points on attention, but it would be quite hard to score 2 for being very inattentive and unable to follow the question, and somehow still get everything else in the 4AT correctly. And the other way of scoring a 4AT of 2 would be to make 2 or more mistakes in the AMT4, but get the months of the year backwards correct, and for there not to be an acute change, and for you to be at a normal level of alertness. So there's 2 main ways of scoring a 4AT of 2. And this can hide quite significant levels of memory impairment in some people. And again, there's a wide level of variation. With a 4AT of 3, you've scored 2 in one area and 1 in the other. So that might be 2 mistakes in the AMT4 and making a mistake in the months of the year backwards. And that's probably the most likely way that you've done that, because again, it would be unusual to be untestable for months of the year backwards and somehow only score 1 elsewhere. Once you get to a 4AT of 4, well, the most common way of scoring this is probably to score 2 for AMT4 and 2 for being untestable in the months of the year backwards. And this indicates somebody with quite significant levels of memory problems. So they're unable to talk to you. They might be saying some words, but they're not able to engage in conversation. But you must have otherwise scored them as being alert and not drowsy, and them being their usual selves. So that would be somebody, say, with a quite significant level of dementia. You can see there's a couple of other ways to score 4 as well. You might answer everything correctly, but somehow not be your usual self, and that can be the case. You can have subtle memory problems that are not picked up by the 4AT. It would be unusual to be hyperagitated or very drowsy and then answer everything else correctly, but possible. So again, a 4AT of 4 gives you a rough idea of someone's level of cognition. If we jump to, say, a 4AT of 12, well, that's quite a dramatic piece of information. That's a full house that tells you that somebody is acutely confused, really inattentive, and probably not answering the questions from the months of the year backwards, not answering the questions from AMT4, and they're not their normal selves. It's quite a powerful piece of information to tell me that somebody's got a 4AT of 12. So, a useful way of roughly describing someone's level of cognition, and much better than, I think, describing someone as orientated or confused. If you're using the 4AT already as a screening tool for delirium, I'd recommend that you add this to your handovers or the way you present patients. As I'm about to describe in a future video, it's going to be a really valuable piece of information and can help me as a consultant geriatrician when people tell me this information.